All right, I've got one for you, Adam.
All
In
right, let's do it.
Massachusetts, a prior state representative, she went up on the floor in Boston and said, we need to confiscate all the money in the land of every private school in the Commonwealth and make them all public schools and put that money into improving all of the local schools. Now, the thing about Massachusetts, we have dozens of private schools older than the country itself. This is how education started. These are high schools. And she said she went up on the floor of the House and said, we need to ban and banish these and take the money. And the whole state, I mean, far left to far right, no matter how you identified politically, was like, no, this is an absolutely crazy, unthinkable idea. And that is the story I use when I want to talk about the Overton window.
Okay.
There's a range of conversation that we are allowed to have. I say allowed, that society is willing to have on a topic.
Yeah.
That there's this range that policy is willing to go on. Some stuff is reasonable to have a conversation, and other stuff just goes, I'm sorry, what?
Yeah. Well, so talking about the Overton window, and it's great to be back with you again on this Thursday because I absolutely love talking about different subjects. I was actually talking about the Overton window recently with a group, and they were like, well, why can't we just get this done? Like, why can't we just, dismantle, this institution or this whatever? I said, well, does it fit into the Overton window? And they were like, what is that? And I teed it up by basically saying, let's take any policy spectrum that you have. Anything, whether it's education, whether it's immigration, whether it's the right to try, anything like that. What on one end, what's the most government control? On the other end, what's the least government control? And now that's the policy spectrum. We write out everything. So if you're taking your schools, for example, on one end, you have government controls every single school. Government controls what's taught at the schools. Government is in control of everything. And on the other end,
private schooling anywhere.
Nothing.
K and above, graduate schools, total government control.
Right. And on the other end is no laws whatsoever. I mean, your kids don't even have to go to school. It's basically, some would call it the wild, wild west.
Everything is private schooling. The one-room school, that's okay. Homeschooling, that's okay.
However you
Whatever
want to
model works for you. There are no government schools on the other far end.
Yeah. But the reality is we're not at either end of that. We're somewhere in the middle. And society, outside influences, the media, all these different things are pushing on where that's at. So give you an example. Let's talk about that education for a little bit. During COVID, when parents started to become more aware of what was happening within their child's education, that Overton window really began to shift away from government control.
Right? Shift hard and quick.
Yeah. Because one of the things that they really noticed was, oh my gosh, I don't think that the government's doing a good enough job educating my children. And even if it wasn't that, maybe it was just a conversation, virtual schooling isn't right for every kid.
Yeah.
Or maybe that led to the conversation, well, maybe government controlled, maybe every student doesn't learn the same, right? And so that began to shift that Overton window ever so slightly to where we're having states all across the country now. I mean, I'm trying to remember who was the first one that did like a big school choice. Was it Arizona?
So Arizona's done it. Florida did big ESA programs. New Hampshire has a big ESA.
I mean, before COVID, it was like, when they did it, it was like, this is monumental.
Yeah.
Like, this is so like crazy that they were pushing that Overton window and they were pushing this stuff to where now, ever since that's happened and that Overton windows began to shift because of, like I said, outside forces, parents becoming more knowledgeable of what's, going on in their schools, people running for school board, people getting more involved, that Overton window shift to where now it's like, if you're not in that, like if you don't have school choice in your state, you're behind. Whereas just even 4 years ago, it was like, or I guess pre-COVID, 5 years ago, it was like, this is groundbreaking ideas. These are crazy.
Nobody talked about the idea of a micro school. Nobody talked about the idea of what if parents had control of the tax dollars for their child, and then a teacher says, yeah, I'll take 10 kids and I'll just run a micro school. That idea, I don't think I ever heard of that idea before 2021. And now it's become popular. It's been codified into law, and there are students that are learning better than they ever have before. The idea of virtual schooling didn't happen. And when we got shoved on us, I'm a parent. I had 2 kindergarteners and a 4th grader when COVID hit. So I got right into virtual schooling. A lot of teachers in my district made a Herculean effort to do this well for their kids. And some have turned to a point where they say, I can teach kids anywhere in the world. That was never a conversation before COVID. All these radical ways of learning, all these new ways of truly focusing on a student never existed prior to COVID.
And take our
And
own
the argument of how to teach. Yeah.
Our own
Yeah.
training department. Pre-COVID,
Yeah.
everything that we did was in person. I mean, every
Yes.
training that we offered was in person. We had to have a trainer fly out and talk about it. But here we are, you and I
Yeah,
today,
right.
5 years later, and we're
Yep.
doing these same trainings, talking about these same things virtually, reaching, hundreds of people all across the country.
October of 2019, I was sitting in a room talking about the idea of doing virtual trainings, and we all said, we just don't know if anybody will be willing to tune in. And then 6 months into COVID, in September-ish of 2020, we had done 852 live trainings from the Grassroots Leadership Academy, all virtual.
Yeah.
That is the muscles that we flexed. Myself and another trainer, 48 hours after that Friday, everything shut down. We did our first training.
Wow.
Yeah, we've been doing it for a while, and it works. So that can be a really quick shift of the Overton window. Like all of a sudden, like the glass is shattered. So this can also take a long time as well.
Yeah, and I mean there are things that it's taken a long time for it to move, and both sides are constantly pushing at this, right? If you want to talk about the Overton window, you do have that side that's always pulling for government control.
Yeah.
And then you have our side that's, we're advocating for more liberty-minded individuals to make decisions without government interference. One of my favorite questions that one of our former trainers always asks is, if the government doesn't do it, would it still get done? And I love thinking about that. Every time I look at a policy spectrum, I say, if the government didn't do this, would this still get done? Let's talk about one that hasn't moved as quickly as, school choice has.
Well, I'll tell you, cannabis reform is a 30-year slow move of the Overton window. And now today we have dozens of states that have legalized it effectively.
Yeah,
and I want to push it federally. And this was slow moving. There was no one moment where everybody said, "Oh wow, this needs to change." This was, what does this look like? What is this study? What can we learn here? Does this make sense? Does this criminalization make sense? Does the time match the crime? All of these over 20 years of working to change opinions.
Yeah, and speaking of this, we recently did that training with John Ebel, where we were talking about overcoming the backfire effect. And one of the things that we briefly touched on was criminal justice reform and how for a long time it was, we're going to be tough on crime. We're going to be extremely hard on criminals to stop it. And it worked. It worked for a little while. But what did research show us? And you saw that Overton window begin to shift from being extremely hard on crime to, as the recidivism rates came back and people were released, and you have these hardened criminals back out on the streets that are going back in a second time, a third time, and it's overwhelming the judicial system. That Overton window began to shift back away to actually, how do we make it to where criminals are getting rehabilitated and not just incarcerated?
Right. Or is this a mental health issue? Is this a psychological thing? Is this a symptom instead of a problem?
Yeah. And speaking of Oklahoma, and you were talking about cannabis reform, the Overton window for a while, it's pretty obvious where it's at right now here in Oklahoma. In 2018, we passed overwhelmingly medicinal marijuana. You could have marijuana if you got a card that was prescribed by a physician or whoever. And that's where the Overton window was. That was that end of it. Yeah. And the other thing there is also people sharing their stories of how they have overcome that. And I know that this next month in June, we're going to be doing a training with Mike Sylvester on storytelling and how do you best message your stories. A few years later, we tried to pass recreational. marijuana, and
Yep.
it failed almost in the exact inverse. It was medicinal marijuana was accepted 2-1, was about the vote, and then
Mhm.
the recreational was killed 2-1. It was like, okay, we know where that Overton window stops right here. So if
Yep.
you're advocating for recreational, what are the things that you need to now do? And I'm sure that there's lots of people listening to us that they know where that Overton window is.
Yeah.
Whether it's when you're talking about education within your own community, whether you're talking about criminal justice reform, whatever your issue is, it's so important to know where that Overton window is. And then what are the things that you need to do to help push that forward? Do we need to have
Right.
people share stories? Do we need to get better research, better facts? Do we need to look all over the place? I
Right.
was recently working with our state director in Ohio, and he's talking about big, bold changes. He said it's so frustrating because I look around and we're mid in the Midwest when we should be number one in the nation. It's like every other state around us has gotten, these things done, whether it's getting rid of the state income tax or having transformational policies that are making people more free and removing barriers. He's like, why can't we be doing that? We've had a trifecta of Republican leadership in both the House, the Senate, and the executive offices and the governorship since 2011. Why
Yep.
can't we get this done? And the question there is, well, where's the Overton window at? What's the appetite for people?
Right. And that's where it comes to powerful as you as a grassroots leader. Because as a grassroots leader, you have to make a choice. You identify the Overton window, both locally, county, state, as what is that norm, the normative, the acceptable, sensible conversation. And do you want to be the person who pushes what's in the Overton window? Or do you want to be the person who pushes outside of the Overton window? So if you as a grassroots leader say, oh, wait, this policy I'm advocating for is within the Overton window, it is this conversation that we are having and we are willing to have, build your policy coalition, start your 5, 10, 20s, start your power mapping, get your coalition together, make it happen. If you're in the radical ideas of thought, well, you've got a longer road ahead of you,
Yeah.
but have that conversation. This could be overnight, this could be decades. Or you could be, getting back to that state representative in Massachusetts, you might be talking about unthinkable things.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe she did it knowing that this was not a real conversation, but she's sowing that seed for 20 years down the line. And that is it. The Overton window. You may hear someone, I use this phrase a lot when I'm talking about anything political. I say, well, no serious people have actually said that. This is a bunch of anonymous accounts on X, on Twitter that this is not a serious account. They may be out there trying to push the Overton window in a certain direction. So no matter which way you're looking at it, if you want to be that grassroots leader that advocates for freedom, for liberty, then this is the direction. You need to see what can be talked about. And are you that radical, or are you that person who can get that popular policy passed right away?
Yeah. And the thing that I would say is the more that you educate yourself, the more that you educate others, understanding where that Overton window is within your own community, like you said, is going to be key to having those correct conversations. Because, like you said, there's people that aren't serious and they're just throwing things out there against the wind, hoping that something sticks, throwing darts against the wall. But whenever we have real conversations with individuals and we're pushing ideas that are on the line or just right inside, that's how we're going to keep it moving. Because the more that you can work, the more that you can push it every single day for your side is another day that the other side is, falling behind. And that's where I was speaking to a group in Ohio recently. And as everybody knows, I spent a lot of time in Ohio, but they were like, we feel like overnight our freedoms were just starting to be taken away. Things have been, they said, this is not the same country as it was 20 years ago. I said, well, did it happen overnight or did it happen incrementally where someone was pushing that Overton window back the other direction after we gained all these freedoms, whatever it is? I forget what exactly they were talking about, but have you been advocating for your side or were you just sitting there idly by? Because if you're not holding that line, someone else is pulling against it.
All right. And I think that's it. Let's get back together in about a week. We'll talk about another one of our grassroots concepts.
Yeah, absolutely. And you can check out more at glatraining.org. It's a great website to check out what we're working on within the country. There's a training coming to you, or if you want to request a training, you can go there. Be sure to like and subscribe to our YouTube channel. What's the correct handle for our YouTube?
It is Grassroots Leadership Academy. Full title, full
Yep.
name, Grassroots Leadership Academy.